My trauma and crisis intervention model is based on post-traumatic stress disorder and the double bind. I wanted to choose something that I would end up using potentially in working in San Diego and where there's a lot of veterans. I feel like I might come across a lot of PTSD and I want to get a fundamental understanding of it. My understanding of PTSD is that it is a trauma and an event related specifically to the symptoms that cannot be assimilated into one's worldview without the person changing. The basic diagnosing factors of PTSD is that an individual has experienced, been witness to, or confronted an event involving actual injury, death, or threatened death. Jumping to the statistics, it's said that in the general population, traumas are experienced in about 50 to 90% of people. PTSD symptoms in the general population ranges from 6 to 9%. And of those PTSD diagnoses, half of them result in chronic PTSD, and a third of those result in symptoms for more than 10 years. PTSD in veterans is estimated to be about 10 to 20% of a prevalency rate. And so what I'm hearing from this is that for some, for at least half of them, it just goes away in time, but not for the other half. And that, to me, as a therapist, I believe that we can do better. So what's the gist with PTSD? It's organized in symptom clusters. They look at it as far as pre, pri, and post factors. They address risk and resiliency in the research. And as I was reviewing this, I just kept thinking that it sounds like the trauma was fearing for your life, and they seem to be stuck in this. I should be dead. I feel like I'm dead, and yet I'm alive. And if half the research is saying that it should be naturally resolved, then I'm wondering why it's maintained. Trauma doesn't always lead to PTSD. So not even all traumas require a clinical response. The range of responses to a trauma can be anything from borderline personality disorder to a phobia to dissociative disorder, eating disorders, depression, somatoform disorders, and in some cases PTSD. PTSD is unique in that it combines both psychological and physical reactions to trauma, kind of takes all those other clinical responses and it has some element involved in it. So I'm going to break down my map in accordance to these symptom clusters. The first one is re-experiencing. Learning theory says that this is a result of generalization. You see sand in Afghanistan, you come home, you go to the beach, and you freak out as if you're back at war. That is a simple explanation of generalization. And cognitive theory uses this concept of generalization and says that you're perceiving a current threat through generalization. The cognitive approach would focus on one's failure to identify triggers and symptoms and teach the individual to distinguish between the events that may be dangerous and pose a current threat and the ones that aren't. So therapy for re-experiencing, the criticism is whether the cues are internal or external. A lot of the therapy is focused on external cues. They're not really sure how to deal with the internal part of this through, like I said, learning theory and the cognitive approach. Therapeutic interventions related to re-experiencing include CBT therapy, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. These are basically symptom reduction and what I would consider a first order change. The assumption here is through therapy, insight would follow the symptom reduction in a way that the individual can integrate the experience into their worldview. The second symptom cluster is avoidance and numbing. Learning theory extends on this and sees this as operant conditioning. They avoid it, which is negatively reinforced as a rewarding coping strategy. The stimuli can also be internal, and avoidance may lead to emotional numbing. So this adds that second component, whereas the first one doesn't really address internal cues, this one does. It also follows learning theory that normally we would become desensitized to a cue, but because they're avoiding it, no desensitization happens. There's an emotional processing model that cites the fear structure related to memory and programmed reactions, and that something got messed up there. So in therapy, the intervention cited would be exposure therapy, specifically prolonged exposure therapy, or in emotional processing words, activating the fear structure while introducing contradictory information. So basically confronting the trauma and making sense of it. So I was thinking about how our current situation related to technology, to travel, makes us different from World War I and World War II. I think it has a lot to do with travel. Previously, they'd spend days coming back home from war, surrounded by their comrades, and they would be able to talk about it and make sense of it for themselves in a group, supported by this sense of belonging. Nowadays, they're on a plane. One day, in less than 24 hours, they could be at their child's birthday party. And they have to just kind of shove that away, assume that maybe later they'll be able to assimilate it, and then put on a happy face and act as if nothing's wrong. So a lot of times, this symptom cluster presents in poor relationships, avoidance and withdrawal, substance abuse for self-medicating, and any associated health consequences from that substance abuse that leads to avoidance and numbing. So part of a therapeutic approach would be psychoeducation for the spouse, that like, hey, this is going on, they're going to need to process this, like maybe encouraging them to join a support group, but just what are their options, and just prepping that spouse for reintegration. Third symptom cluster is hyperarousal. So this one makes the most sense to me. They were hypervigilant. That was an adaptive strategy during war, and it's a conditioned response. So I side with the psychobiological model, where their brains are altered and their bodies are altered in some way. So therapy for this one I see as anti-systemic. The diagnosis as a label can be beneficial to the client, whereas they think they're struggling academically or cognitively and they feel like an idiot, but understanding that their brain has been altered in some way might reduce that feeling, that effect to their self-esteem, and dealing more so with the diagnosis and the physical components. So it's psychoeducation, neural assessments, medication, and also being conscious of comorbidity to substance abuse. Instead of them thinking they're an alcoholic, understanding that underneath that might be PTSD. So same thing, that symptoms should resolve over time. So in chronic cases, why is their body still in the fight or flight? Speaking of risk resiliency, there's the pre, peri, post. Pre would say that they had psychological trauma beforehand. Peri would speak to the actual trauma, and post would be the reaction to that trauma. But the thing is, none of these specific factors can predict whether or not, none of these factors alone can predict PTSD. Side note, human-generated traumatic event is higher risk of developing PTSD. And moving into resiliency, there's personality factors, interpretation of the stressor, spirituality, and social support, which brings me to social support. There's all these benefits to social support, but there's also the contradicting evidence that social support can also be negative. It could lead to exacerbation, and they're not sure if the PTSD causes this or the social support causes the PTSD chronic symptoms. So, moving to my crisis model, I'm going with this social support. First of all, I'm following on Bateson's theory of schizophrenia. Their first thing is moving schizophrenia from a clinical diagnosis of a brain disorder to a communication disorder. And so, first of all, it depathologizes the situation. It's not that something's wrong with him, it's just something's wrong in the pattern that's happening. My model doesn't have a specific intervention that's can be seen as an equation. It's more of a stance. It's understanding that the chronic PTSD is a result of paradoxical communication that has been maintaining the symptoms. That is to say that the messages are contradictory. So the model encourages metacommunication. The victim or the patient or the client is stuck in a situation where he can't talk about these confused things. We don't know if the patient or the victim or the PTSD person is causing this, or if the family is causing the PTSD, kind of a chicken or egg thing. And my job as a therapist would be to see this, work within it, and do more benevolent binds towards emancipation. My empathy comes from I'm seeing the client as grasping for a reason, for logic, for something to make sense, and constantly faced with contradictory evidence. And so, following my model of brief strategic therapy, I'd like to make it a little more in the joking realm. I see PTSD first as the problem, the symptom clusters predicting the intervention that we previously discussed as the attempted solutions. Whether or not it's resolved at that point, 50% of the people do become resolved, or it goes into chronic, which means to me it's being maintained. Making this depathologized and saying it's a communication issue is my idea of a reframe. Bringing in the family and working on the paradoxical communication and directing the client or the family to meta-communicate is my directive, and my results and reinforcing is towards emancipation. Thank you very much.